During the war, the Nazi regime developed a hidden system that turned women into parts of a reproduction machinery. In these breeding farms, neither identity nor will was recognized. Women were selected and subjected, while the children born were separated and controlled from the very first moment. What was happening in those places was designed to erase any human connection. Mothers were relegated to mere instruments, and the children became part of a record that responded solely to the ideology of the Reich. There was no compassion, only a cold mechanism where entire lives were marked from birth. How did this program really work? What did it mean for the women trapped in it? And what was the fate of the children who grew up under the shadow of these farms? The blood obsession, Himmler, and the dream of absolute purity. In Germany, in the early years of the National Socialist regime, the demographic issue became a central concern. At the beginning of the century, the number of births had decreased steadily. The reduction in the birth rate, combined with the massive losses of the Great War and the high number of permanently wounded people, formed a picture that leaders perceived as alarming. Heinrich Himmler interpreted this decrease not only as a statistical fact, but as a sign of the biological weakening of the German people. The widespread practice of clandestine abortion, social pressure on unmarried women, and the flexible legislation of the Weimar Republic reinforced his conviction that the state had to intervene decisively in the reproductive field. Himmler had been born in the year 1900 into a middle-class Catholic family. His father worked as a headmaster at an educational institute, which allowed him to access a solid education. From his student years at the Technical University of Munich, where he studied agronomy, he acquired knowledge about animal genetics and selective breeding techniques. The practical experience of raising birds reinforced his inclination to apply biological principles to the analysis of society. At the same time, he immersed himself in reading authors who developed hierarchical racial theories, like Hans Günther, whose typologies aimed to demonstrate the superiority of certain human groups. In the National Socialist Party, which he joined in 1923, Himmler found the political framework to translate these ideas into action. His rise in the Schutzstaffel was steady until reaching the leadership of the organization in 1929. From that position, he began to implement concrete measures of racial selection. Starting in 1931, he required applicants to prove Aryan ancestry back to the mid-19th century. This requirement involved genealogical research in parish archives and civil records, as well as detailed physical examinations that evaluated facial body proportions and other anthropometric traits. To coordinate these processes, the Office of Race and Resettlement was created, known as WWII. Its work consisted of evaluating personal files, issuing classifications, and establishing racial hierarchies. These tasks were supported by protocols developed by scientific institutions like the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology. Under the direction of Eugen Fischer, measurement systems were developed that encompassed dozens of physical characteristics, each scored and combined to produce a global profile. The scope of these evaluations was progressively expanded to the spouses of SS members, making marriage a decision subject to state scrutiny. The legal framework accompanied this administrative construction. In July of 1933, the law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases was enacted. Under this regulation, the forced sterilization of individuals with physical, mental disabilities or social conditions considered undesirable was authorized. In the following years, hundreds of thousands of individuals were sterilized. This policy represented the restrictive side of the demographic program, preventing the reproduction of those classified as unfit. Himmler conceived these measures as a complement to a positive strategy. The state had to promote the reproduction of those evaluated as bearers of valuable qualities. In his internal discourse, he frequently resorted to analogies from livestock breeding, comparing the selection of human partners to the selection of animal breeders. Under this logic, reproduction became a matter of technical management where the authorities defined criteria and procedures. In December of 1935, Himmler founded the organization known as Lebensborn eingetragener Verein. It was formally registered as a private entity, although it was financed with mandatory fees from SS members calculated according to military rank. Its initial statutes declared as objectives to support large families, provide assistance to single mothers considered racially suitable, and guarantee care for children of parents classified as valuable. Behind this formulation was a controlled breeding project whose purpose was to increase the population considered Aryan. The administration of Lebensborn was designed with the bureaucratic rigor characteristic of the regime. Each application was processed with standardized forms, each birth recorded in files, each evaluation archived in detail. The technical language turned vital processes into impersonal categories: acceptable, valuable, not suitable. Under this classification, access to aid, support for mothers, and the fate of the children were defined. Himmler personally supervised the fundamental aspects of the program. He reviewed reports, received birth statistics, and evaluated recommendations from doctors and anthropologists. His correspondence reveals a constant interest in adjusting procedures, improving selection methods, and perfecting the conditions of pregnancy and childbirth. Administrative precision was combined with a vision of social engineering applied directly to human biology. The territorial expansion of the Reich opened new scenarios for these practices. After the annexation of Austria in 1938, the first Lebensborn institutions were established outside of Germany. That same year, in the Czech Sudetenland, administrative structures that were already functioning in the German territory were replicated. Each incorporated region was evaluated in terms of racial potential, which determined its role within the demographic project. The network of offices, laws, classifications, and programs configured a comprehensive policy. Himmler's obsession with blood purity translated into concrete measures that affected marriages, births, and entire families. The system combined negative controls, such as forced sterilization, with positive initiatives aimed at increasing the number of births among sectors defined as valuable. At this initial point, the policy was still mainly developed within the borders of the Reich, but the regime's expansive dynamic indicated that these practices would not be limited to German territory. Taken body, the woman turned into Reich territory. The National Socialist regime redefined the female condition in strictly biological terms. The German woman ceased to be recognized as an autonomous subject to become a demographic resource of the state. This transformation did not arise spontaneously, but through a framework of propaganda, legislation, and institutional structures that configured motherhood as a patriotic duty. From 1933 onwards, the Reich's propaganda machinery consistently spread the image of the mother surrounded by children, presented as the ideal of femininity. In newspapers, magazines, posters, and radio broadcasts, this representation was reiterated to establish a uniform model of female behavior. The association between fertility and national loyalty became the dominant message, reinforced with language that placed motherhood on the same level as military service. Pregnancy was described as an act of combat in a biological war that would define the future of Germany. The official recognition gave tangible form to this discourse. In 1938, the Cross of Honor of the German Mother was instituted, an award in 3 grades that distinguished women according to the number of children. The award ceremonies took place in public events with the presence of local authorities and coverage in the press. Photos of award-winning mothers appeared alongside headlines praising their contribution to the Reich. Motherhood thus became an honorary title inscribed in a framework of civic prestige. The economic policies accompanied these symbolic measures. The matrimonial loans created by the state functioned as a direct incentive to birth rates. Each child was born with a concrete material benefit, the partial forgiveness of the debt. With 4 descendants, the loan was completely settled. This mechanism linked family financial stability to reproductive productivity, transforming the domestic economy into an instrument of demographic policy. In parallel, the legislation on abortion consolidated the mandatory nature of motherhood. For women considered racially valuable, the voluntary interruption of pregnancy was absolutely prohibited. The penalization intensified over the years until reaching in 1943 the introduction of the death penalty for those who practiced, facilitated, or disseminated information about abortive methods. Pregnancy ceased to be an individual decision and became a legal and biological obligation, inseparable from the female condition in the Reich. The recruitment of women for controlled maternity programs, such as the Lebensborn, was developed on multiple fronts. In the educational system, young women received training that exalted motherhood as the highest contribution to the German people. In the youth organization Bund Deutscher Mädel, the idea that giving children was equivalent to defending the homeland in combat was repeated. At the local level, doctors, midwives, and party officials identified candidates and directed them to evaluation centers, presenting participation as a privilege and patriotic duty. The admissions process was regulated by the Race and Resettlement Office. The first filter consisted of genealogical verification through the Ahnenpass, a document that certified Aryan ancestry up to the mid-19th century. The review could be prolonged for several weeks, with a thorough analysis of parish records and civil archives. A surname associated with Slavic origins, a documentary gap, or a doubtful ancestor was enough for immediate exclusion. The candidates who passed the documentary phase were subjected to physical and anthropometric examinations in the SS medical facilities. Doctors recorded height, weight, eye color, hair color, and skin tone. They measured the shape of the skull, jaw, nose, and the distance between the eyes, noting every detail on standardized forms. The examination was conducted under strict observation, with no privacy for those being evaluated. The exclusion criteria were broad: visible physical imperfections, scars, body asymmetries, hereditary diseases, or family history of mental disorders and alcoholism. Social and political reputation was also checked, with interviews conducted with family members, neighbors, and co-workers. The evaluation integrated biology and ideological loyalty into the same file. The final classification divided the candidates into hierarchical categories: valuable, acceptable, or not suitable. The first ones accessed the services of the program with priority. The second ones could be admitted according to availability. The third ones were definitively excluded, with annotation in official records that could affect employment, access to benefits, or participation in other institutions. Admitted women lost immediate autonomy. In the Lebensborn maternity homes, daily life was governed by internal regulations. Wake-up times, meals, exercise, and rest were established by the administration. The diet was designed according to nutritional criteria defined by SS doctors, with foods considered representative of German identity. Contact with the outside was limited to what was authorized. Correspondence was censored, and visits were supervised. The residents could not leave the facilities without formal permission, nor decide on their own medical treatment. Their role was reduced to reproduction under state control. Motherhood was administered as a technical process with forms, files, and permanent supervision. The female body was managed as a biological resource in a system that turned intimate decisions into administrative matters. The official speeches presented this subordination as a privilege. The women admitted were described as mothers of the nation, bearers of the highest mission. However, the actual treatment turned them into instruments of a project designed by male leaders. Social pressure reinforced this dynamic. A refusal to participate could translate into rumors, community isolation, or suspicions of political disloyalty. The result was the systematic transformation of the female body into territory administered by the Reich. Sexuality, pregnancy, and motherhood were brought under the control of a bureaucratic apparatus that defined the parameters of reproductive life. Women went from being considered as individuals to functioning as pieces of a demographic machinery directed from state institutions. This model, consolidated in Germany, anticipated its extension to the occupied territories where population policies would acquire new dimensions. Hidden gear inside the Lebensborn houses. On the 15th of December 1935, the first maternal home of the Lebensborn program was inaugurated in Steinhöring, Bavaria. The building, a former nursing institution converted, was deliberately located in a rural area on the outskirts of Munich. The location responded to a logic of discretion and control. The geographical isolation allowed activities to be kept away from public attention and ensured permanent supervision over the admitted women. During the following years, similar institutions multiplied in Germany and Austria. The chosen properties were, in most cases, adapted castles, rural mansions, spacious country houses, or old sanatoriums. The selection of buildings followed criteria of distance from urban centres, controllable access, and availability of land that facilitated isolation. This pattern aimed to reinforce the idea of self-sufficiency and preserve institutional discretion. The interior design adhered to central guidelines. The spaces combined medical rooms with collective dormitories and instruction areas. The equipment included modern gynecological and obstetric instruments, beds adapted for deliveries, and equipment intended for postnatal care. The decoration integrated medical symbols with iconography of the regime, SS insignias, Germanic runes, portraits of political leaders, and maps showing the Reich's territorial expansion. The dominant colors were hospital white accompanied by red and black, the official tones of the party. In each room, selected reading materials were placed, brochures on racial hygiene, biographies of leaders, and texts on Germanic mythology. The administrative structure of each home was headed by a director, usually linked to the party or wife of an SS officer. The staff included doctors, midwives, and nurses chosen both for their technical training and their ideological adherence. The surveillance systems were strict. Conversations were recorded, activities were supervised, and contacts with the outside were controlled. Visits were limited, and correspondence went through prior censorship. The daily routine began early. The inmates followed fixed schedules for hygiene, breakfast, and medical checkups. The diet adhered to nationalist principles of food self-sufficiency. Priority was given to locally sourced products: rye bread, milk, butter, pork, vegetables, and seasonal fruits. Imported foods like coffee were replaced by local herbal infusions. Foreign spices were prohibited in line with the idea of preserving cultural and biological purity, even in nutrition. The regimen included specific physical exercises for pregnant women, supervised walks on the grounds, breathing practices led by instructors, and body stretches to strengthen muscles associated with childbirth. These activities served a dual purpose: to optimize the physical condition of the expectant mother and to reinforce the conception of motherhood as a discipline regulated by the state. Ideological indoctrination was an inseparable component of everyday life. The inmates attended daily talks on reinterpreted Germanic history, Norse mythology, and theories of racial biology. Diagrams, photographs, and educational materials were used that compared supposed racial types, placing the Germans at the top of a fictitious hierarchy. The objective was for the women to assume motherhood as a biological responsibility towards the Reich. Cultural and recreational activities also had an ideological charge. Traditional songs collected as Germanic heritage were promoted, readings on the historical greatness of Nordic peoples, and celebrations of pre-Christian festivals. The Christian religion was marginalized. Attendance at Mass and visits from clergy were not allowed. Instead, ceremonies inspired by Germanic pagan rituals were held, organized to reinforce the spiritual identity defined by the party. Birth protocols followed medical and symbolic criteria. Deliveries were attended exclusively by institution personnel, avoiding anesthesia as much as possible. Resistance to pain was presented as a test of racial strength, under the premise that Aryan women should endure suffering as a contribution to the quality of their offspring. This policy was justified with pseudo-scientific arguments about physical superiority, framing pain as a formative element for the biological mission of the Reich. After each birth, the characteristics of the newborn were meticulously recorded: weight, height, eye color, and hair color, along with other physical traits. This data was incorporated into individual files and sent to central archives, with a copy to the personal office of the Reichsführer SS. An immediate racial evaluation was applied, measuring the baby's body and facial proportions. The result determined their classification and, therefore, their fate. In some selected cases, births were accompanied by ceremonies designed by Himmler and spiritual advisors. These rituals replaced the Christian baptism and included water from springs considered sacred, verbal formulas that linked the child to the Reich, and the imposition of Nordic names. SS officials acted as symbolic godparents with the mission of supervising the child's ideological education. The fate of the newborn depended on the classification obtained. Those categorized as valuable were prioritized to be given to SS families, often through adoptions processed with altered documentation to conceal the origin. Those considered acceptable could temporarily remain under the institution's custody, be adopted by party families, or be raised in orphanages controlled by National Socialist organizations. Those classified as unfit received different treatment. They could be sent to medical institutions, to orphanages with no direct links to the party, or registered as common births without program benefits. In many cases, the separation between mother and child was immediate or occurred a few weeks after birth. The decision was up to the administrators of Lebensborn, not the maternal will. The function of the women ended with the gestation and delivery, while the management of the child's fate was under institutional control. Each child received a file that integrated physical, medical, genealogical data and racial evaluation reports. These records constituted the documentary basis of the program and fed centralized demographic planning. The detailed documentation allowed systematic tracking that transcended the immediacy of birth, projecting each child as an element of a long-term policy. In this way, the Lebensborn homes functioned as cogs in a hidden mechanism that combined medical care, social discipline, ideological indoctrination, and administrative control. Motherhood was transformed into a top-down directed process, and newborns became strategic resources for the Reich. This network, initially limited to German and Austrian territory, would soon expand to the occupied regions where it would acquire much more complex dimensions. Plundered childhood, the massive kidnapping in Eastern Europe. The invasion of Poland in September of 1939 marked the beginning of a systematic policy of child appropriation in Eastern Europe. This measure did not emerge as a secondary consequence of the conflict, but as a planned part of the Reich's racial objectives. In 1940, Heinrich Himmler ordered the incorporation of Polish children with traits considered valuable to integrate them into the German community. The policy responded to the strategy of depopulation and ethnic replacement in the occupied territories. The first operations occurred during mass deportations of Polish population. At railway stations in Warsaw, Krakow, and other cities, SS agents and RUSHA officials separated minors from their families. Those who presented physical characteristics in accordance with the Germanic ideal were taken away from their parents and sent to transit centers. The selection favored light hair, blue or green eyes, athletic build, and certain facial proportions. The preferred age ranged between 2 and 12 years, a stage in which it was considered possible to effectively modify cultural identity. The practice spread to Czechoslovakia after the complete occupation of the country in 1939. Selection teams inspected schools, children's hospitals, and orphanages using similar anthropometric parameters. In 1942, the destruction of Lidis as retaliation for the attack against Reinhard Heydrich included the selection of minors among the survivors. In Yugoslavia, after the invasion of April of 1941, operations concentrated especially in Slovenia, where children with traits compatible with the racial ideal were prepared for relocation. The magnitude of the practice is difficult to quantify due to the destruction of documents at the end of the war. However, the most cautious estimates indicate at least 200,000 Polish minors kidnapped, tens of thousands in Czechoslovakia, and thousands more in Yugoslavia and other occupied territories. These figures reflect the breadth of the child Germanization program. The selection was not limited to superficial observation. Specialized teams called Rassenprüfer made up of doctors, anthropologists, and officials from the Russia, applied measurements with anthropometric instruments. Cranial proportions, height relative to age, jaw structure, nasal shape, and eye distance were analyzed. Each characteristic received a score which, combined, produced a final classification. This procedure, which could be carried out in a few minutes, determined irreversible destinies. The classification reports established 3 categories. Minors suitable for immediate Germanization were sent to German territory. Those considered suitable with reservations remained in transit centers for additional examinations. Those classified as unsuitable were excluded and faced various fates, from forced labor to abandonment in precarious conditions. The transit centers multiplied in Poland and Czechoslovakia. The most important was established in Łódź, renamed Litzmannstadt, where a facility known as Kinder KZ operated. Although it appeared as an orphanage, it functioned as a racial processing center. There, more detailed medical examinations were conducted, and the process of cultural transformation was initiated. The children were given German identities by assigning them Germanic first and last names. Their original documents were destroyed or falsified, and the use of their native language was prohibited under threat of punishment. Siblings were separated to weaken family ties, and accommodations were organized by age and gender. Learning German was imposed with methods of forced repetition and sanctions. The idea was systematically conveyed that their parents had died or abandoned them, while reinforcing the narrative that Germany was rescuing them and offering a better future. The minors classified as suitable were distributed in different institutions of the Reich. Some entered Lebensborn homes, where they received treatment similar to those born in the program. Others were sent to SS orphanages or given up for adoption to families selected based on ideological criteria. The adoptive families were provided with instructions on how to consolidate Germanization, including fictional stories of supposed German origins of the child. Education continued in National Socialist schools with curricula designed to reinforce the new identity. A reinterpreted history was taught that justified Germanic superiority, geography that emphasized the German right over Eastern territories, and racial biology that maintained the inferiority of Slavic peoples. Children who did not meet racial criteria or showed resistance were sent to children's camps like those in Łódź and Kalisz, where overcrowding, malnutrition, and lack of medical care resulted in high mortality rates. Teenagers were assigned to forced labor in agriculture or industry under military supervision and with minimal rations. The youngest or sickest were at risk of inclusion in covert euthanasia programs, where they were denied medical assistance or subjected to lethal procedures presented as treatments. The administrative system accompanied each phase. The files contained original data, racial evaluations, new German identity, medical reports, and final destination. This documentation was centralized in WWII offices, which maintained complete records to ensure control of the process. The existence of these files demonstrates that child appropriation was part of a centralized policy, planned from the upper structures of the SS. The looting of childhood in Eastern Europe not only reflected the brutality of the occupation, but also implemented a model of social engineering designed to transform entire populations. The kidnapped children were reduced to biological resources managed by the state, while the territories of origin were deprived of entire generations. As the war advanced eastward, these policies took on an increasingly broad character, extending to new regions under German control. Occupied Norway, the genetic colony of the Third Reich. The German invasion of Norway in April of 1940 opened a particular scenario within the racial policies of the Third Reich. Unlike what occurred in Poland, Czechoslovakia, or Yugoslavia, this territory was considered by Heinrich Himmler and the Race and Resettlement Office as a space with exceptional genetic potential for the expansion of the Germanic community. The SS ideologists interpreted the predominant characteristics in the Norwegian population as close to the Nordic ideal defined by National Socialist doctrine. Himmler had pointed out in internal documents that the Scandinavian peoples maintained a high biological purity, linked to a supposed continuity with the ancient northern Germans. In reports to the Führer, he described them as blood relatives whose integration should be encouraged through specific assimilation policies. During his visits to Norway between 1940 and 1943, he publicly stated that the country should become a genetic reserve for the European future under German hegemony. In his speeches to SS officers, he emphasized that Norwegian racial characteristics were more homogeneous even than those of Germany itself, and that it was a strategic mistake not to take advantage of this biological advantage. This approach determined a strategy different from the one applied in Eastern Europe. In the occupied territories of the East, violence, deportation, and kidnapping of minors predominated. In Norway, on the other hand, the promotion of voluntary relationships between German soldiers and local women was encouraged, presented as unions of superior biological value. The presence of more than 300,000 soldiers in a country of only 3 million inhabitants favored this permanent contact between occupiers and the civilian population. The occupation authorities, following Himmler's guidelines, approved policies that expressly encouraged sexual relations with women who met racial criteria. In August of 1940, Reich Commissioner Josef Terboven and collaborator Vidkun Quisling issued the guidelines on German-Norwegian relations. The document stated that such ties were to be promoted as part of the Nordic unification project, modifying the usual military regulations that in other territories punished this type of relationship. The propaganda spread in Norwegian media and in military publications described these unions as an expression of a shared destiny among Germanic peoples. The soldiers were given illustrated manuals explaining which physical traits were most valuable according to racial doctrine. Furthermore, it was authorized that those who had children with Norwegian women would not face disciplinary sanctions, constituting an exception compared to the regulations applied in other occupied countries. The motivations of Norwegian women were diverse. Some maintained voluntary connections, influenced by personal attraction, material benefits, or promises of protection. Others found themselves subjected to implicit pressures in an occupation context, where access to food, fuel, or medicines could depend on contact with soldiers. The war situation limited real decision-making capacity and placed these relationships in an ambiguous terrain between voluntariness and coercion. Between 1940 and 1945, between 12,000 and 15,000 births from German fathers and Norwegian mothers were recorded according to civil and military documentation. Norway thus became the only country outside the Reich where the Lebensborn developed a stable network of maternal institutions. Between 8 and 10 houses operated in different regions, with a particular concentration in Oslo, Bergen, and Trondheim. The decision reflected the strategic priority given to the territory within the racial project. The operation of these houses followed protocols identical to those applied in Germany. Free medical assistance, accommodation during pregnancy, and childbirth care were offered to women linked to German soldiers. The aim was to ensure births under controlled conditions and to register the newborns in the program's records. The funding came from the Central Lebensborn organization through contributions from SS members, and the staff included German doctors sent to Norway, supported by carefully selected local midwives and nurses. Births were meticulously documented and the newborns evaluated according to anthropometric criteria. Those who met parameters were registered as citizens of the Reich from birth, and their mothers received certificates granting benefits within the occupation system, including preferential access to food rations and official protection. It is estimated that around 8,000 births occurred in Norwegian Lebensborn facilities, while several thousand additional were registered in common hospitals under the program's supervision. In certain cases, the children were taken directly to Germany to be raised by families of SS officers, although the majority remained in Norway under maternal custody or in orphanages controlled by the collaborationist regime. The documentation indicates that between 200 and 300 were sent to the Reich for formal adoptions. The Lebensborn homes offered single mothers an escape from the traditional stigma of pregnancies out of wedlock, guaranteeing discretion about the father's identity and granting official status to the child. The German defeat in May of 1945 radically altered the situation. Women who had maintained ties with soldiers were stigmatized as collaborators and given the derogatory name Tisketöse. In the weeks following the liberation, between 30,000 and 50,000 were publicly marked, without distinction of circumstances. The reprisals included shaving of the hair, public humiliations, and job marginalization. The children born from these unions, known as Tiskebarn, suffered prolonged discrimination. In the schools, they were isolated, stigmatized as descendants of the enemy, and subjected to constant mockery. During the post-war decades, between 1,000 and 2,000 of them were interned in psychiatric institutions or state centers, often without medical justification. Subsequent investigations revealed that some were subjected to psychological and pharmacological experiments in hospitals in Oslo, Bergen, and other cities during the 50s and 60s, under supposed research on behavior inheritance. The procedures included administration of experimental drugs, electric shocks, and prolonged isolation, all without consent or legal guarantees. These practices were justified with theories about supposed antisocial tendencies inherited from German ancestry. The stigma persisted for generations. Many grew up with false identities, concealed by adoptive families, and only discovered their origins in adulthood through official records. Institutional silence surrounded this phenomenon for decades. The Norwegian government did not publicly acknowledge the consequences of the Lebensborn program until the end of the 20th century. The archives remained classified and the cases were treated individually, avoiding admitting the collective dimension of the problem. It was not until the 1980s that organizations of adults born under the program emerged, initiating campaigns for access to documents, official recognition, and compensation for post-war discriminatory policies. Piles in ashes, the collapse of a project without full condemnation. In January of 1945, while Allied forces advanced into German territory from different fronts, Heinrich Himmler ordered the systematic destruction of documentation linked to the SS racial programs. Among the main objectives was the complete elimination of the files related to the Lebensborn program. The directive was issued by the SS Economic and Administrative Office and coordinated directly with the Reichsführer headquarters. The purpose was to prevent the records from being used as evidence in the legal proceedings that the Allies would organize after the defeat of the regime. On the 18th of January of 1945, Oswald Pohl, head of said office, distributed a detailed instruction ordering all regional managers to incinerate without delay the sensitive material of racial biological nature. This category included complete genealogical records, medical files of women admitted to Lebensborn homes, birth and adoption records of children, and administrative correspondence between the different offices of the program. The implementation of these orders showed centralized planning. In the western areas of Germany, where the evacuation of facilities was developing more orderly, industrial furnaces and incineration equipment were used to ensure complete destruction. In contrast, in eastern regions, where the Soviet advance was rapid, more improvised methods were resorted to, such as bonfires in courtyards or the blowing up of entire buildings. This difference explains why more documentary fragments survived in territories occupied by the Red Army than in those liberated by Western forces. In Bavaria and Austria, where some of the most important Lebensborn homes were located, cremation lasted for several days and used industrial equipment to reduce all the material. In Bohemia and other areas in the east, the destruction was more partial, allowing certain files to be captured by Soviet troops. These documents remained classified for decades and became accessible in a limited way only after the end of the Cold War. Pohl's directive distinguished between materials. Some general medical records could be evacuated if circumstances allowed, but any document with a high security classification had to be destroyed. When the Allied troops arrived in the spring of 1945, They found facilities that did not correspond to the model of concentration camps. The Lebensborn homes looked like rural mansions, adapted castles, or well-equipped medical clinics. On the 2nd of May, 1945, a United States unit discovered the House of Steinhöring. Captain Thomas Royal's report described the initial surprise: a building with children's rooms, orderly cribs, and staff presenting themselves as nurses and midwives. The lack of documentation prevented the identification of the children housed there. Similar situations were repeated in Austria and Bohemia, where soldiers found partially evacuated institutions with traces of recent medical activity but no records to reconstruct their operation. The documents that survived were fragmentary. They included incomplete listings of births, partial forms of racial assessment, and internal communications. Although they confirmed the existence of an administrative apparatus, they were not sufficient to determine the full scope of the program, nor to establish individual responsibilities. The facilities themselves had diverse destinies after their discovery. Some were converted into Allied military hospitals, while others served as reception centers for refugees and displaced persons, which was paradoxical considering their origin as institutions of racial control. To prosecute those responsible for the SS racial programs, the Allies organized a specific trial known as the Russia case. Officially titled United States versus Ulrich Greifeld et al., it was held between October of 1947 and March of 1948 as part of the subsequent Nuremberg trials. The process included 14 senior officials linked to the Reich's racial institutions. Among the accused were Ulrich Greifeld, head of the Reich Commissioner for the Strengthening of German Nationhood, Max Zollmann, administrative director of Lebensborn, and Gregor Ebner, chief physician of the program. The prosecution filed charges for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and membership in criminal organizations. In relation to Lebensborn, it was argued that the institution had collaborated in the systematic kidnapping of minors in occupied territories and in the appropriation of children considered racially valuable. However, the defense benefited from the absence of complete evidence, a direct consequence of the destruction of documentation. Zollmann and Ebner maintained that their work was limited to medical and social services for German women, without involvement in kidnapping operations. The court recognized that there was a program of Germanization of minors, but it could not prove that Lebensborn was the direct executor of the abductions. Of the hundreds of thousands of children who disappeared in Poland and other territories, only a small fraction could be linked to the maternity homes through verifiable documents. For this reason, Zollmann and Ebner were acquitted of the most serious charges, although they were convicted of membership in the SS. The sentences imposed on the rest of the defendants were less than expected. Greifeld received life imprisonment, although he died in prison a few years later. Other defendants received between 10 and 25 years of sentence, several later reduced. The start of the Cold War decisively influenced these results. The priority of the powers shifted towards political and military confrontation, leaving in the background the exhaustive judicial prosecution of second-level officials. In the Federal Republic of Germany, many doctors and administrators linked to Lebensborn resumed professional careers without facing significant consequences. Gregor Ebner, for example, practiced as a private pediatrician in Munich until 1966. In the Soviet occupation zone, the captured files were used as propaganda to denounce the Nazi regime, but did not lead to additional judicial processes against intermediate personnel. The silence about the program lasted for decades in the international arena. Lebensborn received marginal attention in studies on Nazism, overshadowed by the documented crimes of concentration camps and military operations. The fact that it was not declared a criminal organization in Nuremberg contributed to that historiographical invisibility. The practical result was that much of the medical personnel, midwives, and administrators who had participated in the management of maternity homes or in the bureaucratic handling of the program evaded legal responsibilities. The combination of destroyed files, limited trials, and political priorities derived from the Cold War generated conditions of effective impunity. The absence of complete documentation and firm convictions left the real magnitude of institutional responsibility in the implementation of the controlled reproduction policies of the Third Reich unresolved, a gap that still conditions the historical memory of these events. The echo of blood, survivors marked by memory. The defeat of the Third Reich in May of 1945 left thousands of children born under the Lebensborn program in an unprecedented legal and social limbo. With files deliberately destroyed and institutions dissolved, many of these minors were left without documentation establishing their real identity or family background. In Germany, Austria, Norway, and other countries where the maternity homes had operated, the so-called Lebensborn children became a group marked by the origin of their birth and the symbolic burden of having been part of a state racial experiment. The babies found in the facilities were transferred to orphanages managed by occupation authorities or by religious institutions that had survived the conflict. There they were registered as war orphans, a broad designation that concealed the specific circumstances of their origins. This classification diluted the differences between children without families because of the war and those who had been born as part of a biopolitical project of the Nazi regime. In German and Austrian territory, children of single mothers associated with SS members faced rejection in their immediate communities. The stigma associated with being descendants of the defeated organization complicated their integration into school and social life. Post-war social services reports describe cases of children being attacked by peers, excluded from group activities, or pointed out by adults who knew their background. Some adoptive families returned minors to state institutions upon discovering their connection to the program. In Norway, where the documentation is more complete, it is estimated that between 1,000 and 2,000 children identified as descendants of the program or from relationships with German soldiers were interned in psychiatric institutions or custody centers during the 1940s and 1950s. These internments did not necessarily correspond to medical diagnoses, but to the perception that their origin made them problematic elements for society. Administrative documents from Norwegian hospitals used expressions such as war disorders, a euphemism that concealed a discriminatory practice. The treatments applied included procedures that today are considered abusive. Medical records describe hydrotherapy with cold water, prolonged periods of isolation, and, in some cases, the application of electroshocks to minors. In hospitals in Oslo and Bergen, the use of these children in psychiatric and pharmacological experiments presented as studies on the inheritance of behavior was also documented, conducted without consent or legal guarantees. In Germany and Austria, many children were adopted under reconstructed identities. Official records were altered by occupation authorities seeking to integrate them into common families. In other cases, the documents were hidden or remained classified by governments. As a result, numerous children grew up without knowing their real origin. Starting in the 1960s, some accidentally discovered the truth through civil procedures, archive searches, or family comments, revealing inconsistencies in names, dates, and places of birth. The psychological impact of these findings was profound. Adults who had considered themselves German since childhood suddenly faced the revelation that they were of Polish, Czech, or Yugoslav origin and had been Germanized in the early years of life. Others discovered that their biological parents had died during the occupation. These revelations generated identity crises and feelings of rootlessness that lasted for decades. In the first decades after the war, the issue remained silenced in most of the countries involved. In West Germany, Lebensborn was not significantly included in educational programs or commemorative policies. The focus was on concentration camps and more documented war crimes. In Norway, the matter became a national taboo. The government avoided publicly acknowledging the existence of specific policies toward the mothers and children of German soldiers. In France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, those born from these relationships were categorized as children of the occupation, without distinguishing those directly linked to the program. The destruction of files, institutional concealment, and social stigma produced prolonged invisibility. Many adults born into the program lived without knowing their history, while others who knew it faced rejection without official support. The silence began to break in the 1980s when groups of adults born under Lebensborn started to organize. In Norway, in 1986, the first formal association of children of the occupation was created, which later established contact with similar organizations in Germany and Austria. The media coverage of individual testimonies sparked academic interest. Historians and journalists accessed archives that were previously inaccessible and published studies that placed the program in the history of Nazism. Documentaries produced in Germany and Norway showed adults narrating their late discovery of origin and the difficulties experienced in childhood and youth. In 1999, the association Lebensborn was founded in Germany, comprised of people born in maternal homes. The organization offered psychological support, promoted access to the fragmented archives, and provided public visibility through conferences and interviews. The demands for recognition received a progressive response. In 2002, the Norwegian government issued an official apology addressed to the mothers and children linked to the program, acknowledging the discrimination suffered in the post-war period and establishing limited economic compensations. In Germany, recognition was later and partial. In 2006, a program was created for access to documents for those who could demonstrate a relationship with Lebensborn, although without widespread material reparations. The study of the program gained relevance in contemporary debates about genetics and assisted reproduction. The existence of a state system that sought to direct human reproduction according to racial criteria became a reference point in discussions about biomedical ethics. Researchers in bioethics pointed out structural parallels between the racial classification of Nazism and modern techniques of embryo selection, although in different contexts and with different motivations. For the survivors, participating in these debates meant adding an additional dimension to their experience, transforming their personal memory into a collective warning about the risks of subordinating human reproduction to political or ideological objectives.